My name is Mark Lynas. I am working with the Cornell Alliance for Science. I'm generally talked of as an environmental campaigner, and actually that's the label I want to keep, because for me it's about the sustainability of the planet in terms of agriculture, in terms of climate change, all of these different aspects. So that's been my motivation for the last 20 years, and it's still my motivation today. So that hasn't changed. I may have changed some of the ways I think we can achieve that, but in terms of the overall objectives, that still remains the same. Sustainability means that, it means a different thing now than perhaps what it did when it was first coined back in the mid-1990s. I mean, now we recognize that we're going to see a population of 9.5, 10 billion people in the next 35 years, that we're going to have to double food production, so increase it by 100%. And at the same time, we're going to have to do that without increasing the area of the world's cropland, so that we can protect the rainforests and continue to have a planet which is relatively biodiverse and which is climatically stable. And so that's what sustainability means, and it's a very direct concern. It's something which concerns this generation. It's not an issue just for the future, as I think it used to be always thought of. In terms of the GMO debate, I think the media's come a long way, although it's different in different parts of the world. So if you're in China today, there's extraordinary conspiracy theories circulating in the social media as well as in the mainstream media about how GMOs are an American plot to turn Chinese people sterile and stop the country ever achieving superpower status to challenge the US. So you've got these kinds of geopolitical paranoia coming into the picture, and these kinds of cultural undercurrents actually affect a lot of the debate in different parts of the world. You'll see this in Africa, where there's a lot of the post-colonial aspect that people say they don't want foreign technology, that's something that's come from outside, bringing in big corporations. And so the political agendas underlying the whole GMO debate are always there. But I think it's become steadily more scientific. I think the media is getting much better informed about what GMO even means. And in some countries, and I would single out the UK and the US as well, increasingly, the debates become much more meaningful, and people who read the mainstream media can actually get a much better idea of what any of this even means. I don't think it's fair to compare scientists with campaigners. Scientists have to do something. They have to breed the new rice which is going to get out to farmers and be flood tolerant or whatever. Whereas campaigners, all they do is campaign. Their job is communications. So for proper bona fide scientists, communications is a sideline necessarily, because they need to tell people what they're doing. But by and large, they can get on with their work in the lab, and they can have something at the end to show for it, which is scientifically meaningful. So they're very different things. And I wouldn't ask any scientist to become a full-time campaigner or to become so emotionally invested in a particular ideological position that it affects their science. And I've seen that with some scientists who work on climate change, and also with some scientists who are involved with biotechnology. They become, I think, so obsessed with fighting the battles, the ideological battles, that they do lose touch with what science really means, which is always being open-minded, always being able to change your mind according to new evidence, things like that. So that's what science has got and scientists have got, which no one else has, and it's the most valuable thing. Well, I've been through a lot in the last few years being involved in the GMO debate, and it just reminds me how humans are very essentially a social species. We need to get approval from our peer group. And when I was initially frozen out of my environmentalist peer group for coming out and saying, I think we made a mistake on the GMO issue, it was very wounding, and it was a very difficult thing to live with. But I've kind of found a new peer group within the scientific community, and in some ways I've got new friends, and we can move on. But nobody wants to feel like they're a voice in the wilderness, and I think that's part of being human. And I think you also have to remember that nobody makes decisions based on a straightforward sort of Spock type rational assessment of the evidence. We're all motivated by emotional intuition, and that's how humans work. You can't engineer that out of our species. But we have the scientific method, and we have evidence-based risk assessment, and these things are vitally important and need to be protected in our societies. But they're never going to take over what it means to be human. I think golden rice is probably the most important GM project in the world, not just in terms of what it stands for, but in terms of what it is. So it's symbolically very important, which is why Greenpeace and anti-GM campaigners have focused very specifically on it. because it's directly humanitarian, it's non-corporate, and it by itself torpedoes all of their anti-GM arguments. You know, it doesn't tick any of the boxes that people have if they're concerned about Monsanto and about weed killer and all these kinds of things. And it's incredibly important in and of itself. If golden rice succeeds and becomes widely adopted amongst poorer households in parts of Asia where children are vitamin A deficient, that will save tens of thousands of lives on an annual basis, if not more. Now, we don't know whether that's going to be the case because it's not out there. There's trials still to be done, and the social adoption will depend on all sorts of things, whether people want yellow rice, whether it's been demonized as GMO and therefore people don't dare to touch it, and all of this kind of stuff. You know, but that's the political aspect to it. But the fact the science works is already very clear, so it has an enormous potential to make a big difference, both in the real world and also in the whole more tortured landscape of communications on GM. The problem with vitamin A deficiency and many other micronutrient deficiencies is simply that people are very dependent on the cheapest source of calories, which is either just rice in this part of the world, or cassava in Africa, or something else, which is basically just starch. And so the argument is that, well, you know, we've got to solve poverty and that this somehow takes away from that focus, which I think is, you know, poverty will hopefully be solved, but that's a gradual process and takes many decades. In the meantime, millions of children are going to die. You know, what are we going to do about it? We need a very direct intervention. And it's very interesting how, where biofortification has been used in other parts of the world, you've got orange flesh sweet potato in East Africa, which is already improving the vitamin A status of tens of thousands of people there. No one's against it because it's non-GM. But they're saying that biofortification won't work, exactly the same technique won't work for golden rice because it's GM. So there's a complete illogicality in the opposition there, and you can see when you focus in on it, what they're concerned about is the GM aspect. And there's no science behind that, it's just straightforward superstition. I think Greenpeace has got itself into a corner on this one because they are putting a lot of resources into opposing a project which has only a humanitarian point to it. You know, this isn't opening the door to multinationals. This is a very direct, targeted intervention aimed at saving the lives of millions of poorer children in developing countries. I still don't understand why they're against it. I mean, I know all of the standard anti-GMO arguments are made, but let's just address one question. If it was non-GM, would they still be against it? It seems to me the answer is no. So the only objection, because they say you could use marker-assisted selection, but there's no way to get genes for the production of beta-carotene into rice unless you use genetic modification. They had to come from outside the rice breeding pool. Any scientist can tell you that. So if it can be proven to be safe, and if people will eat it, and if it will make a big difference to their nutritional status and will save lives, why should it not be used in the wider world? I just don't understand why an environmental organization with such a fantastic reputation, many decades of really effective and useful campaigning work on climate change, fisheries, deforestation, would want to get itself stuck down this hole of opposing something which could save so many lives. I'm becoming more and more fascinated with agroecology, which is often used as an alternative to GM. I mean, what I really don't want is to become a sort of GM obsessive and to go around insisting, kind of like the flip side of the anti-GM movement, that GM is the great solution to everything. And every scientist will say it's no silver bullet, you know, it's appropriate where you've got really no other options because you've got to bring in genes from outside the breeding pool. But that's only, even just the type of seed is just one part of the picture. What about the wider agronomic strategy? What about how are you going to reduce the amount of nitrogen? How are you going to protect biodiversity on the wider scale? How are you going to protect the genetic diversity of crop species? You know, all of these things have been raised by organic farmers and raised by the agroecology movement, and they're actually real issues which we need to address in conventional farming. So I think some way down the line we will get to a situation where we can learn from each other properly. And where we don't have this huge, you know, Berlin Wall of the GM, anti-GM debate really dividing the scientific community from the environmental movement. I think the two should come together.